Hey everybody, it's Dr. Dave Fletcher, and you are on with the exciting next version of Insight on the Insights. And today's discussion is really all about the exciting new advances in reporting and reporting and relating our test results to the patients. Now, I know that this is an ongoing theme, but it really is where the rubber hits the road. And I know that if you've been sticking around with our Insight on the Insights most recently, you've realized that we have this new game changer out there, which is the core score. And really, the core score has been tested and retested in a variety of different clinical situations. And I can just tell you that the purpose of this call is to remind you that the core score is really the most effective and most powerful way to really get this point across of where a patient is headed in terms of their overall state of stress management. Remember that the core score is a combination of the three big sensor retained neurological views, which are EMG, which gives us a viewpoint of the tone and the amount of work that the muscles are doing to give us support, and that we then understand that there is a thermal read, which gives us the level-by-level reactivity of the balance within the thermal capacity of the sympathetic motors. And then, of course, there's HRV, which looks at the overall balance within the score of the person's adaptability. And as I've taught you before, HRV really represents the reserve that a patient is working from. Now, I know much of this is redundant for those of you who have listened in before, but I want to just highlight how important it is to be able to tell a patient that what you're really tracking more than anything now isn't just the individual colors or scores on each of these three tests, but also the benchmark, which is how the computers and how now our scoring system blends these three scores together to give an integrated scoring approach, which we refer to as the core score. Pardon me. And this is the incredibly easy and patient understandability goes through the roof when you start to sit down and talk to them about what their score is in relation to the standards. Now, this is based on a 100 scale, and so each of the scores is allocated a numbering system, which we've done in the past with the NSFI. And then what we now have done is developed a proprietary weighting protocol, which blends the three scores, HRV, EMG, and thermal, all together. And what we basically can tell our patients is that the new computerized programs now attribute a score to each of these data points that they've collected through each of these sensors. And then one more step is that we now attribute an overall score, which is easier to track for both the clinician and the patient. And what it really means is that we're looking, and this is how I want you to report it, is that we're looking at the amount of efficiencies within the nervous system. Stress has a tendency to stain how a nervous system works. What we mean by that is that the more interference that there is sitting in a nervous system, the less responsive, the less capacity the nervous system has to react and respond to the needs of the environment. So if those needs are immediate, as in there's an instantaneous need to access the sympathetic systems, for instance in fight-flight, of course it's going to respond, but it needs to have some power to respond without causing long-term fatigue. That's where HRV comes into it. We want to really see if their reserve is going to be able to be maintained. What if we sit down and look at the chronic state of fatigue that a patient is in when we ask them to do the simplest task, which is just sit there and watch how much energy or work their muscles have to do? Now, what that really tells us is what the EMG is showing us is that they have poor amount of energy distribution, or in this case, energy usage. And we're going to talk about distribution on that scale in just a moment. But finally, the last point is to see that if over time we can see how the deeper reactions, the control mechanisms within the organic systems are being interfered with. And that, of course, is looking at the thermal scans. Remember, when there's an imbalance along that thermal array, segment by segment, we're looking at the pre-ganglionic seeds coming from the spine, going to the ganglia, and then these reads are in the balance of the post-ganglionic fibers. And this means that if there is some chronic distortion going on in this regulatory capacity of the sympathetic motors, which, if they can't regulate temperature, they can't regulate their internal functions of the blood vessels, organs, etc., then what we need to realize is that this chronic stress is going deeper. It's affecting their overall health. And as you've heard me say again in other ones over and over again, that what we do know is that if we're looking at different layers of tension within the spinal core, then what we recognize is that if layer 1 and layer 2 are muscles and joint systems, then a person can exhibit a lot of reflective back pain. On the other problem, on the other end of the scale, is that as a person begins to hold on to this tension, it has a tendency to alter their functions deeper. We no longer have a back problem alone. They're starting to develop health issues, and that's our greatest concern. So let me go back for just a moment. I think some of the confusion, too, rises in understanding the EMG graphics that we have. We have a number of different graphics that a person can read and relate to a patient. And again, I tie this all together because you can get lost in relating the individual scans, but what I want you doing is I want you relating the whole system of the core score to them. So what we know is that you can look at a raw data score. That's the bar graph, and that literally is showing how much energy is being used when compared to a normative database. And what we know is that as the person expends more than they should to perform a controlled task, as in sitting, looking straight ahead, proper posture, not jamming their body forward or upright without it, but just generally engaging gravity, we know exactly how much the database should tell us is being expended, and that's the graph. The data is then taken from there, and we can then look at an asymmetry graph, because remember, amplitude, which is raw data, and symmetry relate to the physiological principles of how well a person can maintain balance and tone. And so we can look at the asymmetry graph, and we can start to begin to see where shear forces are going to be starting to affect the spine itself, a lot of torsional strains. And I'm constantly telling my patients that in a spinal perspective, torsion or torque is one of those forces that is very destructive to a spine. If you leave torque and torsion on a spine, you can have a lot of extended wear and tear patterns associated. So when you take a look at the asymmetry graph, you typically can get a read on how much sway or torque is being applied. And of course, if it's consistent from scan 1 to scan 2 to scan 3, we know that torsional strain is pretty deeply embedded. And that's active. Remember, these are active reads. These are not passive like an X-ray, where you look at the end stage. This is where you're seeing active, in this case, torque or sway. But the pattern graph is really one of the most interesting reads on the system. What we're really looking at, and I want you to understand this, is the efficiency of distribution. When we take a look at it, we remember that in the raw data graph, what we're looking at is comparative to a normative database. So level by level, we're looking at how much energy is being expended, but we're really not looking at how that energy is flowing or distributing down through the entire chain. So in the pattern graph, what we are looking at is independent of the amount that's going through the spinal core region as comparative to the normative database. We're looking at how the degree of flow of that neurological energy is traveling down that array. And so rather than comparing it to mild to moderate individually, we're looking and seeing if there is adequate distribution to allow adequate support or firing. And so when we take a look, for instance, at inadequate supply along this neurological, in this case, motor signal that's coming down there, we many times can read a flattening or a driving in of that line, where there's a collapse of the signal as it's coming out, and so it drives in, and so the distribution is actually impaired. This is probably one of the most significant readings of the pattern graph, is that you're looking at it from side to side, and you're observing how how the body is distributing, how the brain-to-body connections are being distributed. And you start to look, and just imagine that there's an angling in or a slash inwards. This means that the distribution of that motor signal is being impaired or interfered with. Well, you can appreciate that locally this could be where there is that indeed interference pattern or subluxation that we're looking at. On the other hand, if the distribution is overwhelming in some areas, we'll pick that up as the deepening, green, blue, and red colors, which we represent on the chart there. The midline of that white zone is the neutral or the regulated amount that we would like to see the distribution curve look like. And you're all familiar with it. That's what we see is the hourglass shape or the vase shape that we see coming in there. So I want you to remember that when you're looking at that, the score that we call the pattern score really is indicative of the efficiency of how that distribution is. And if it's high or low against that midline, then you are going to get a lower pattern score, which means a lower efficiency score. We also recognize that there's symmetry from side to side of this distribution, not of the signal, but of how the signal is being distributed. And what that means is that we can score an efficiency, if you would, in the symmetry. And finally, and this is the one that seems to confuse a lot of people, if there is an equal amount of energy being distributed right down the center line, and then we would just arbitrarily index that at 100. It's not like 100 kilojoules or any regulated number. It's just a distribution index. And what we know is that if there is too much energy that is being distributed, as we see a lot of times in youth and in very active muscles after exercise and things of that nature, then that will be more than 100. On the other hand, if there's really poor distribution, and we see this when there's chronic fatigue and that there's chronic subluxation patterns, all those angles in and that flattening of the line, we'll see a less than 100 score. And so we use this reference point so that people can really get comfortable with looking and seeing whether they are tracking in the right direction, as in if they're too high and distributing too much energy, obviously wasteful, dyskinetic, then we'd like to see that number above 100 come closer to 100 on subsequent scans. On the other side of it, if we'd like to see, a neurological awakening where the person is getting their adjustments and working through these challenges, then we can definitely start to see an improvement in that getting closer to 100 from the lower than 100 score. So I hope that gives you some, pardon the pun here, but insights into how the distribution scores and the pattern scores are correlated. And of course, tie this all together, this is far too much information to try and tell a patient, which is why we've developed this uncomplicated approach called the core score, so that you as the clinician can get a really good feel for what each of these tests really means. That's the purpose of me helping you interpret them. But when it comes to reporting, we don't want to have a terribly long and drawn-out experience with the reporting. We want to be fast and to the point and give the patient a reference. Again, we go back to the medical model, which there's so many factors, for instance, that influence a person's cholesterol score. They could be in any state of liver process. They could have, cardiological issues that are lying behind it, dietary, lifestyle issues. Those all are what the clinician is aware of and builds into it. But what the patient remembers is what their cholesterol score is, or if it's a blood sugar number, what their number is. So they walk around not necessarily knowing exactly what was the triggers and causes. They rely on the trusted advisor, as in their clinician, to make those decisions with them. But with the core score, we can now do the same thing as the medical people have done with their anything from blood pressure numbers to blood sugar numbers to cholesterol numbers. We now can put together a core score number, which we've talked about is related to the amount of core control that a patient has. This is the efficiencies of how well the nervous system is managing stress. And in this case, it's managing stress locally, which we measure, as I just said, between the thermals and the EMGs, and globally, which is how we put together the HRV into the mix. So remember, we named it the core score for a couple of reasons. Number one, it's very, very, very common. It's Sounds good, the core score, but it's a very common term for people to relate the spine to the core. And of course, what we draw a distinction between is that there are two cores within the body. There is the support core, which most everyone is familiar with, which is the core of around the waist. This is the core that people talk about doing their ab work with, and the core. And we refer to that as the support core. However, the core that we're most concerned with, and the one that we score on the core score, is the communication core. This is the core, like the core of an apple, that runs between your brain and your body. And it is a tunnel under which, or a conduit through which the nerves that regulate every function within your health travel through. So it communicates signals from the brain to the body and the body to the brain. And it is imperative that this core communication is operating at a high efficient rate. And this is what we can score on the core score. So you can see that we've put a tremendous amount of effort into giving you clinical tools, but also now reporting tools. And this is why it becomes so critically important to operate your practice under a watchful and dedicated approach to benchmarking where a patient's core score is at, and then adding into that a series of reexaminations that go along. Now, the cool part about this is that, you should be reporting that core score to a patient, certainly on a 12-visit model if that's what you're doing, because it's simple and easy. Now you can do it in under 10 minutes, 5 of which is unattended by the clinician. And so there's no reason not to do this on a consistent basis, because it gives such great reference points to you, the clinician, and to the patient for their understanding. And it also means that you're not trapped by this. If you want to, you can collect data points on how a patient is after an incident, and then use the core score a little later on to benchmark how things are going. For instance, if a patient's had an incident, you can easily pop in an HRV or pop in a rolling thermal scan just to get data for your information at that visit time. Coming down, maybe as soon as you're getting this, we're going to be bench testing a brand new rolling thermal, which is going to be wireless, which means that you're going to have table-side accuracy at using this without being hooked into having to take the patient and move them into the exam room. If you have some mobile capacities in your computing, you're going to literally be able to have this available table-side and report on a thermal scan literally to the moment, and this is exciting. So we're trying to do everything we can, and this is my background, being in the trenches and in the clinics for 30-plus years, to try and bring out the efficiencies and the immediacy of reporting and the validity of reporting for each and every one of you. Now, the other side of it is that what we know is that you are going to want to be able to report the core score in a very convenient way. And one of the things that I've added into it through our engineers and our software programmers is the ability to take this core score and report on it off an iPad, which means that you'll be able to, in a wireless environment in your office, take the data from your scanning computer, if you would, and call it up anywhere in your office on an iPad, so that you can, instead of having to print out, and it's expensive to print, believe me, I've printed tens of thousands of these things, and I know how expensive it is, to literally bypass the printing protocol if you want to. You can always print it if you're so inclined, but to sit down and take an iPad, which we now keep in each of our in our adjusting area, not in each, but we have one around our adjusting area, and I just literally key in the patient's numbers, and before you know it, I've got their recent scans up in front of me, and what that means is that I can report on the core score immediately when it comes out, and it gets better than that. We've made it now so that when you send a patient home, you can certainly send them home with the paper-printed version, but they will also have access to look up or call up their scans. And this is pretty cool because, sometimes patients are so excited about it that they want to really, show their friends and family what they've gone through. They want to tell them about the stress that's related to it, and they don't always remember the words that matter. And in the patient site that they will now have access to, we're going to be developing and building more and more dialogue, which is going to be myself teaching them about what it means to understand a scan, what chiropractic really represents, and just an added boost to the story you've told them will now come through the web and give them more information that they can use, and sometimes a second voice like my voice, who has done a lot of extensive research on this, can support the validity and the reliability of the scans that you're providing for them. Again, our goal is to develop your practice into a retention and loyalty hub. I've done it in my practice using these tools, and I know that you can do it in your practice to where you want to get this massive PVA. Mine sits well over 100 all the time and consistently because we spent the time to not guess at what was going on in a patient's health, but to give them the valid and reliable reporting that the scan and now the core scores give us. Well, I hope this has been one of those upgraded insight on the insights for you. And here's hoping that this makes it all the difference within your practice this coming week and for many months to come. Signing off from Insight on the Insights, it's Dr. David Fletcher, and we're here for you to grow a